Hello. In this video, we'll be talking about relatively recent implementation methodologies of enterprise systems. At least recent when compared to the traditional system development lifecycle. Okay, now let's start there. Now, there are critical assumptions of the traditional enterprise information system development lifecycle. The first one is that the phases are carried sequentially, one by one, and the second is that a phase must be 100% complete and correct before the next one starts. That's also why traditional SDLC is called the waterfall model. For instance, the analysis of the business requirements must be complete before you start with the design, and design must be complete before you start the implementation, and so on and so forth. The entire design of the system we are talking about. Otherwise, if put for example, for the design based on incorrect requirements, for instance, can be wasted, which is a lot of effort. However, real projects rarely follow a sequential flow. Due to changing customer requirements or business or business conditions, you can go back to previous stages, or you but you usually go back to previous stages, do the things again, and come back, and so on and so forth. So in real life, you go through many loops or what we call iterations. As an alternative, in fact, iterative, or also known as Agile approaches, have been proposed and used. In these approaches, you typically do multiple waterfall cycles in a project. You take a part of the future, you do the analysis, design, implementation, testing, and sometimes even put it in the operation for use by the end users. Then you pick the second part, and then you do the same thing. You go through the same cycle with this particular feature until all parts are implemented. So in the meantime, if some other parts of the system has to change, then you can handle such changes in future iterations. So essentially, the phase approach that we discussed in a previous video, phase transition approach, emerged, or it has been introduced as a consequences of these methods, or to address the needs of these consequences of these methods. Now, okay, let's see an iterative approach. That is somewhat a hybrid of traditional and agile, I must say, based on the Oracle Unified Method. On the upper part, we see the project management phases, which are discussed in another video. So you can mostly ignore these phases for the time being if you have not watched the project management videos yet. First, the phases. In this method, the implementation project goes through through these phases instead. Inception, elaboration, construction, transition, and production, and finally the operation and maintenance is the same here. But what is different here is that the project activities, here they are, at least majority is here, are not performed fully in a single phase, but spread over multiple project phases depending on the nature of the activity. For instance, the activity of business process architecture, which basically entails the understanding of business processes and improving them, happens not only in the first stage, but it starts here and with the most well-known defined processes, and continue a bit less intensively with the remaining phases. So the processes that are already defined are taken as input for the next project activity, which is in this particular case the business requirements definition and mapping, as you can see here. So what should we say? So in fact, there's a logical sequencing in the first 6 project activities here, as the one takes the output of the previous activity as input. For instance, in the in the elaboration phase, we might be doing quite many activities concurrently, but each dealing with a separate part of the system. You just do part A or feature A, business architecture, business process architecture in feature A, and then and feature B at the same time, business requirements definition, and it goes like that. So I'm not going to details of these project activities in this video, but you will be able to find more information about these in the lecture handouts. You will see them later on. And as you can see, there are quite many project activities spread over multiple phases. And the benefit of this thing that it allows multiple teams to work on different tasks all at the same time. Also note that once the system is in production, that's in use in the use period, during maintenance, many activities are revisited to handle the changes or improvements that are uncovered in the normal project time period. Okay, now this is a well-known approach, iterative and incremental approach for system implementation, and as I said in the handouts, you will receive more material slides that describes these phases and activities. But for now, let me discuss about more recent approaches, also called Agile Approaches to system development. And these approaches go one step further, in fact, to handle the changes during the implementation. And let's see how they do it. Now, essentially, these approaches have emerged in the software development field, initially for the development of relatively small software systems with small teams, also as a response to the traditional approaches. But they have gained considerable popularity over the years, also in enterprise system implementation projects, and nowadays any company that develops or offers software systems in one way or another would say that they are doing Agile. Perfectly or not perfectly is a question right now, but it's out of the scope of this video. The most commonly known ones are the Scrum and XP. XP stands for Extreme Programming, and so I mean the reason why such approaches have emerged is as follows. It takes quite a long time to implement a system, and in the meantime, things often change considerably. In the traditional approaches, you face difficulties in coping up with the changing requirements, business processes, environment, and policies and rules, and so on and so forth. So Agile approaches allow for changes to a large extent, as they are based on iterative system development approaches like the one that we have just seen. But these particular approaches that I'll mention in a minute are taking it to an extreme. How do they work? They work as follows. Now, you start with a quick analysis phase where you determine the scope of your implementation or development, let's say. You determine the big chunks of features that the system should offer. You prioritize them, you group them together. Next, you take one feature, work on it with the user. That's very important to define what this feature is and what it should do. Then in rounds of 1 to 4 weeks, which are usually called sprints, by the way, you perform the design, implementation, or coding, testing, and sometimes again even the deployment and operation concurrently. And you do this incremental development of 1 to 4 weeks again for all features until they are all implemented. Now, you have interleaved project tasks within a sprint. So at each sprint of, again, 1 to 4 weeks, the analysis, design, implementation, testing, and even the use are concurrent and interleaved, or let's say interwoven for each release. So it is difficult to distinguish these kind of activities within a single sprint, within a single short time period. So it's really all together in 1 or 2 weeks, for instance. You have to ensure that the users are active, by the way, and provide feedback quickly on a daily basis. Good thing is that this way of implementation gives further flexibility in handling change. So if a requirement is missing or wrong, or you realize during operation of one feature that has already been put in use, if it is missing something, if it has to change, it can be corrected in the next release, or after going through another sprint, which is simply another round of implementation or incremental development. Now, there are quite many things that need to be careful about these approaches, or at least when following these approaches. First and foremost, following it requires intense discipline and structure. So it's not an easy thing to do. It's a tough one, but if properly done, if properly followed, it can really be quite efficient and effective. It requires very strong and intense commitment, starting from the top executives all the way down to the end users. And as mentioned, strong user involvement is really mandatory here. If you cannot make sure that the end user is with you on a daily basis, then you really increase the chance of failures. Although it is arguable, agile approaches work usually better with small teams, up to 10 people or so. Now, let me finally briefly talk about some agile principles in enterprise system implementations. Agile approaches definitely push for the vanilla approach. You see the vanilla approach in a previous video, in fact, in one of the previous videos, as it is usually easier and simpler and takes less time when compared to the chaplet, but it has some disadvantages at the same time. But the agile approaches definitely push for the vanilla approach, push for the for minimum customization, not chocolate. So the motto is basically standard features, simple design, and do the minimum. Do the minimum to satisfy the highest priority requirements of the users. So similarly, you don't go through, you don't go with the big bang type of transition. You obviously have to follow a phased approach here. You deploy gradually, deliver function by function, rather than a big bang all at once. You also focus on the core functionalities, as I mentioned. Only those with high priorities are delivered, and that's it. So that is it as far as the more recent approaches to the system development or system implementations are concerned. See you later.